At a star-studded gala, young reporter Brandon Keller sought to challenge Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood, aiming to expose his outdated views. But Eastwood's response left him humiliated. As Keller confidently moved in for the attack, Eastwood's calm, insightful comeback silenced him completely. This exchange wasn't just a clash of generations, it was a battle between wisdom and arrogance. Welcome to Prime Chronicles. A young reporter thought he could humiliate Clint Eastwood, but he never saw this comeback coming. The ballroom at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel glittered with opulence. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the high ceiling, casting their luminous glow across the room. Their reflections danced on the polished marble floors and gold-trimmed walls, making the space feel almost otherworldly. The air was thick with the musky scent of aged whiskey, the floral notes of expensive perfume, and the ever-present buzz of tension that comes with gatherings of Hollywood royalty. The guests, clad in tailored suits and haute couture gowns, floated from table to table, their voices a soft, measured hum. Conversations, filled with industry gossip and veiled compliments, fluctuated between forced laughter and strained politeness. For some, the evening held a deeper meaning. Tonight's gala was dedicated to supporting veterans and mental health initiatives, causes close to the hearts of many in the room. But for the majority, it was just another event to be seen at, another photo op, another chance to network and reinforce their standing within the dizzying hierarchy of Hollywood. Then Clint Eastwood entered. No entourage, no spectacle, just him, alone in a sharp, well-tailored black suit. His hands casually tucked into his pockets, his demeanor exuding the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to announce itself. At 94 years old, Eastwood moved slower than he once had, but there was an undeniable presence about him, an aura of authority that came not from grand gestures, but from the weight of decades in the business. His eyes, sharp and perceptive, scanned the room, and in that brief moment, he commanded respect. Conversations slowed, voices softened, and eyes turned in his direction as if acknowledging a living legend. He wasn't the type to demand attention. He simply received it without effort, without need. He approached a small group near the bar, offering firm handshakes and a few quiet words to old friends. He wasn't one for small talk, but when he spoke, it was as if the room paused to listen, as though his words held value, a rarity in the sea of superficial chatter that surrounded him. Across the ballroom, a young journalist named Brandon Keller was watching. He wasn't a household name, but in the world of political commentary, he was building a reputation as the fearless, unapologetic voice of a new, more radical generation. His articles, sharp critiques aimed at conservative figures, had won him a decent following on social media. Tonight, Keller saw a golden opportunity. Clint Eastwood, in his eyes, was an artifact, a relic from an era that no longer fit the shifting narrative of Hollywood. Keller was ready to strike, to challenge the old guard and prove his relevance. The look on Keller's face, part arrogance, part excitement, made it clear he wasn't here for dialogue. He was here for a takedown. And what better target than a man whose views Keller considered outdated, someone whose time, in his opinion, had passed. But what Keller failed to realize was the kind of man he was up against. Brandon Keller straightened his tie with an air of confidence bordering on arrogance, pulled his phone from his pocket, already set to record, and pushed through the crowd. There was no hesitation in his steps. He wasn't nervous, he was certain, too certain. This wasn't just about questioning Eastwood's beliefs. This was his moment, the viral confrontation that would solidify his place as the voice of a new era. He imagined the headlines already. Clint Eastwood finally called out. Watch him stumble over his own ignorance. As he neared the bar, the atmosphere shifted. A few guests paused, sensing the impending interruption. Clint Eastwood, in the middle of listening intently to a war veteran's story, barely acknowledged Keller's approach. That only fueled Keller's determination. He cleared his throat, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, loud enough to draw the attention of the nearby onlookers. "Brandon Keller, the Sentinel Review. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Eastwood offered a brief, unreadable glance before turning back to his conversation. Keller didn't like that. He took a step closer, his smile faltering but still trying to hold its ground. "I'll make it quick," he added, forcing a small, almost patronizing chuckle. I just wanted to get your thoughts on Hollywood's changing landscape. You've been in the industry for over 60 years. Do you think people like you still have a place in it? The words, people like you, hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, carrying a weight that only a few in the vicinity seemed to notice. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, and the bartender paused mid-pour, sensing the tension. Eastwood, however, didn't respond immediately. He simply studied Keller for a moment, a look in his eyes that seemed to ask, "Is this really worth my time?" Keller pressed on. "You know," Keller continued, "Hollywood is evolving. The old ways of thinking, outdated masculinity, conservative values. A lot of people think it's time for a change, that guys like you are out of touch with what modern audiences want." It was the perfect setup, Keller thought. This was his moment. His audience was ready, the cameras were rolling, and the battle lines had been drawn. But there was one thing Keller didn't anticipate. Clint Eastwood wasn't going to play along. For a long moment, Eastwood just stared at him, not with anger, not with offense, but with an expression that seemed to suggest a quiet challenge. The silence between them stretched on, thick with unspoken words, as the room collectively held its breath. Finally, Eastwood broke the silence, his voice low and deliberate. "You rehearsed that one, didn't you?" A ripple of quiet laughter ran through the small crowd that had gathered, unmistakable and electric. Keller's jaw tightened, but he refused to back down. "I'm just asking the questions people want answers to," Keller replied, trying to salvage the situation. Eastwood raised an eyebrow, a small knowing tilt of his head. "People," he repeated, testing the word as if savoring it. "Or just you?" The question caught Keller off guard. He hesitated. Eastwood leaned forward slightly, resting his elbow on the bar, his eyes locking onto Keller's with the weight of decades of experience. "You think the world just moves forward because some guy with a keyboard says so?" Eastwood's voice was steady, calm, like the opening lines of a character he had played 1,000 times on screen. "That real change happens because some kid points a finger and says, 'That's old, throw it out.'" Keller opened his mouth, but Eastwood didn't let him speak. "Let me tell you something, kid," Eastwood continued, his tone unflinching. "You don't erase the past just because you don't like it. You learn from it. You build on it. You take what worked, fix what didn't, and move forward. That's progress, not whatever the hell this is." He gestured at Keller dismissively, mimicking Keller's earlier hand wave. The crowd's laughter grew louder. Someone clapped, a slow, mocking sound. Keller's face flushed red, but he wasn't ready to back down. "Respectfully, Mr. Eastwood," he shot back, his voice tighter now. "It's easy for you to talk about learning from the past when you were part of a generation that had it easier." The words hung in the air. A murmur ran through the room, but this time it wasn't in Keller's favor. Eastwood's expression softened into something almost pitying. "Easier?" Eastwood repeated the word, shaking his head as if Keller had just said the most absurd thing he had ever heard. "I started in Hollywood when they told actors like me to change their name because it sounded too rough. I worked as a bricklayer before I ever got in front of a camera. You think that was easy?" He let the question hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "You ever had to shovel asphalt in the middle of summer just to afford a meal?" Keller blinked, momentarily stunned. "Let me know if you'd like me to continue." But Eastwood wasn't finished. "I've seen guys like you before," Eastwood said, his voice unshaken, looking for a soundbite, hoping to make a scene. "But here's the thing. You walked in here thinking I'd fold, that I'd get mad, maybe even storm off. I don't do performances on command. That's your job." The room erupted into laughter again. This time it was louder. A few guests even applauded. Keller's posture sagged slightly, the weight of his failure starting to hit him. He scrambled for one last shot, forcing a smirk onto his face. "So maybe you had some struggles," he said, but the fire was gone from his voice. "But don't you think there's a reason people your age are being left behind in Hollywood? Maybe audiences don't want outdated ideas shoved down their throats anymore." Eastwood's response was a low chuckle, almost sad. "Left behind?" he asked. "Son, I've outlived entire Hollywood trends, been written off more times than I can count, and yet here I am, and here you are, using my name to try and make a headline." Keller had no response. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Damn." The silence hung, heavy with the weight of Eastwood's words. The crowd wasn't on Keller's side anymore. They weren't nodding along. They weren't waiting for him to make his point. They were watching him, waiting for him to admit defeat. Keller floundered, desperately trying to cling to his narrative. "I just think people deserve better," he mumbled, the fight gone from his voice. "Better stories, better representation, better—" Eastwood interrupted, his voice measured but final. "So tell him one." Keller blinked, his mind racing. "What?" "You keep talking about what people don't want," Eastwood continued. "So tell them what they do want. Right now, say something that'll matter more than the movies I've made, the people I've worked with, or the history I've been a part of." Keller's mind went blank. His breath quickened, his palms beginning to sweat. This was it. This was the moment he had prepared for, the grand speech that would make him the voice of a generation. But standing before Clint Eastwood, it all fell apart. He had nothing. The words didn't come. He was hollow. Eastwood gave a slow, knowing nod. "Thought so," he said, picking up his drink again. The crowd laughed once more, but this time it wasn't just amusement, it was finality. The conversation was over. Keller had lost, and he knew it. Brandon Keller swallowed hard, the heat of humiliation spreading across his face. He had walked in here thinking he could tear down a legend. Instead, he had been exposed, outclassed by a man who had seen it all before. With a final defeated glance, Keller turned and disappeared into the crowd. No dramatic exit, no fiery last words, just a man who had overestimated himself and been shown up by a veteran who had lived through far worse. Clint Eastwood didn't even watch him go. His expression remained unreadable as he turned back to the conversation at hand. The moment had passed, the battle won before it had even begun. As the evening continued, the atmosphere shifted back to its usual rhythm. But the lesson lingered in the air, like an aftertaste that wouldn't fade. It wasn't about politics or generations or even the fight itself. It was about wisdom versus arrogance. Clint Eastwood didn't need to prove anything. His legacy spoke for itself. In a world of performative outrage, Eastwood stood as a quiet reminder that true strength comes from substance, not spectacle. And as for Keller, well, he was just another name added to a long list of people who had underestimated the old cowboy. The lesson was clear. It's not about who shouts the loudest, it's about who actually has something worth saying.